The clay was cold. It sucked the warmth from Elias's feet, a greedy, thick mud that clung to his ankles and calves. He drove his heels down, folding the wet earth over the layer of dry straw, then stomped it flat again. Beside the shallow pit, his dog, Boro, lay with his head on his paws, his amber eyes tracking the rhythmic, squelching work. A low sigh escaped the dog's broad chest, a puff of steam in the sharp autumn air. Boro had been watching this process for 3 weeks. He was no longer curious, merely patient. This was what his boy did now. He made mud. Elias straightened, his back a column of fire. He was 17, but his shoulders were stooped with the labor of a man twice his age since his father had been laid to rest in the spring. He wiped a muddy hand across his brow, leaving a streak of brown on his skin. From his vantage point on the slight rise where his father had built their cabin, he could see the whole of the valley floor. Ribbons of smoke rose from the stone chimneys of his neighbors, thin and hurried in the wind. They were all burning wood already, chasing the morning chill from their homes. He had not lit a fire in his own hearth for a month. It was a cold way to live, but necessary. The old stone fireplace was a glutton, and his woodpile was barely a quarter of what it should be for the coming winter. A horse and cart rattled up the track that served as a road. Mr. Gable pulled the horse to a stop, his face a road map of weathered skepticism. He was a good man, a man who had known Elias's father for 20 years, but his mind was as unplowable as the rocky north fields. "Still at it, boy?" Gable called out, his voice rough as burlap. He didn't get down from the cart. He just stared at the growing pile of what looked like dung and straw next to the cabin. "The ground'll be frozen solid in a fortnight. You're spending your days making mud pies when you should be swinging an axe." Elias offered a small nod. "I'm getting to the woods, sir." "Getting to it?" Gable scoffed, a dry, crackling sound. "The geese went over last week. The high peaks have got their first dusting. That's not a wood pile you've got there, son. That's kindling for a week, maybe 2 if you're frugal. What in God's name are you building in there anyway?" Elias looked toward the cabin door, which stood open. Inside, the floorboards had been torn up in the main room's center. A deep rectangular hole was lined with flat stones, and rising from it was the beginning of a strange brick structure. "A heater," Elias said, his voice quiet. Gable squinted, his skepticism hardening into genuine concern. "A heater? I saw you hauling those fire bricks from town. Cost a pretty penny, I'd wager. You're building a new hearth inside your house, right in the middle of the floor?" He shook his head slowly, a look of pity in his eyes. "That's the craziest thing I've ever seen. Your father, bless his soul, was a smart man. He knew how to build a proper hearth, against a stone wall, with a proper stone chimney. What you're doing, that's just foolishness." "It'll work," Elias said. It wasn't a defense. It was a statement of fact, as simple and solid as the stones he'd set in the ground. "Wait until winter," Gable said, and it sounded like a curse. He clucked at his horse, and the cart groaned back into motion, leaving Elias alone with his mud and his dog. Boro lifted his head and whined softly, nudging Elias's hand with his wet nose. Elias stroked the dog's thick fur, the simple, trusting gesture a balm against Gable's dismissal. He wasn't foolish. He was following a plan. That night, by the flickering light of a tallow lamp, he sat at his father's small, scarred desk. He opened the journal. The pages were filled with his father's neat, dense script and intricate drawings. His father had been a quiet man, an observer, a reader of books Elias had never seen. He had filled a dozen such journals with thoughts on crop rotation, weather patterns, and strange, brilliant ideas. This last journal was different. It was a single, focused project. The book was open to a diagram of what he was building. A cutaway view showed a small, insulated firebox labeled J-tube. An arrow indicated the path of the flame and hot gas, down a short leg, then rocketing up a tall, insulated chimney, the heat riser. From there, the diagram showed the hot gases being forced back down and through a long, serpentine channel, a flue that snaked its way through a massive earthen structure before finally exiting through a modest pipe in the cabin wall. The earthen structure was labeled Thermal Mass Bench. Beneath the drawing, his father had written, "The common fireplace is a fool's bargain. It burns hot and fast, and 90% of its heat goes straight up the chimney, pulling the warm air of the house out with it. A crime against physics and good sense. But if you burn a small, hot fire in an insulated chamber and force the exhaust gases to travel a long path through a dense mass, you don't just warm the air, you warm the house itself. The clay and stone become a battery for the heat. One small fire, hours of warmth. It is not a fire to sit by, but a fire to live with." Elias traced the lines of the drawing with his finger. He had read these pages 100 times. He understood the principles. It was not foolishness. It was a different kind of wisdom, the kind that looked strange from the outside. The next day he was back at his work. The foundation was done. The firebox, meticulously constructed from the expensive fire bricks, was complete. He had used the last of his father's savings to buy them, a fact that sat like a stone in his gut. Now came the part everyone could see, the part they would judge. He began to build the bench. He mixed the cob, the clay, sand, and straw, and began to form the long serpentine flue that would rest on the stone foundation. He built the walls of the channel first, packing the damp, fibrous mixture with his hands, smoothing it, shaping the curves his father had drawn. It was slow, heavy work. Each load of clay had to be dug from the creek bed a quarter-mile away and hauled up the hill in a wooden wheelbarrow with a squeaking axle. The sand came from further, a pit near the river, and the straw he'd gotten in trade for helping a neighbor with his harvest. Mrs. Finch, a woman whose kindness was as broad as her frame, stopped by in the afternoon, a small pot of stew in her hands. "Elias, you're looking thin as a rail," she said, her brow furrowed with worry. She peered into the cabin, her eyes widening at the muddy behemoth taking shape on the floor. "Dear boy, what is this? Mister, Gable said you were building some kind of dirt chimney?" "It's a heater, ma'am," he said, accepting the stew with a grateful nod. "It stores the heat." "It stores the heat," she repeated, the words foreign in her mouth. She looked from the structure to Elias's meager woodpile. "Child, you can't heat your home with mud. You'll freeze in here. Or worse, if that thing ever catches fire, it'll take the whole cabin with it." Her concern was a heavy blanket, smothering him. "I have a plan," he said softly. Her face softened with pity. She patted his arm. "I pray you do." The work continued. The sun grew weaker in the sky, its light turning thin and gold. The nights grew colder, the frost thicker. Elias worked from dawn until his muscles screamed, then worked an hour more. Boros stayed by his side, a silent, furry shadow. The bench grew higher, a winding mound of earth that filled the center of the room. It was nearly 3 feet high and 18 feet long, curving in a gentle U shape. It looked primitive, ancient. One afternoon, Mr. Sterling, the man who owned most of the land in the valley, rode by on a magnificent black horse. He was a man who measured worth in acres and coin. and he looked down at Elias with unconcealed disdain. "Gable told me you'd lost your senses, boy," Sterling called, his voice sharp and clear. He gestured with his riding crop toward the cabin. "Building a hovel inside your own house. Your father was an odd man, but he wasn't a fool. Whatever he filled your head with, you'd be wise to forget it and learn how a real man provides for himself." He didn't wait for a response, spurring his horse and galloping away, leaving Elias standing in a cloud of dust. Each comment was a small chip at his resolve, but the journal was his bedrock. "They will not understand," his father had written on one page. "Men fear what is new more than they fear the cold. But the cold is honest. It does not care for opinions. It only cares if you are prepared. Prove it with the work." So he worked. He finished shaping the bench, leaving a hollow channel snaking through its heart. He used the last of the cob to build the heat riser, a perfectly vertical column 2 feet taller than the bench, right over the firebox. He plastered the entire structure with a finer mix of clay and sand, his hands acting as trowels, smoothing the surface until it was undulating but even. It looked like a living thing, a great earthen beast sleeping in the middle of his home. As he worked, a new visitor appeared more frequently. Ilara, Mr. Gable's daughter, would bring him a bucket of fresh water from their well, or a loaf of bread her mother had baked. Unlike the others, she didn't mock or pity. She watched with an open, intelligent curiosity. "How does the smoke get out?" she asked one day, her eyes tracing the path of the bench. Elias pointed to a small 6-inch hole he'd left in the far end of the bench near the wall. "It comes out here, into a stovepipe. Most of the heat is gone by then. It's taken by the bench." "The smoke heats the bench," she said, not as a question but as a realization. She touched the surface. It was cold and damp. "It's hard to imagine." "It has to dry," he said. "That's the most important part." Her father's skepticism had not fully taken root in her. She saw the meticulous care, the sheer effort. "You've worked so hard," she said softly. He just nodded, his gaze fixed on his creation. The first snow came early. It wasn't a blizzard, just a delicate, persistent fall of white flakes that dusted the world in a coat of sugar. It was beautiful, and it was a warning. The bench was not yet dry. Gable's words haunted him. That thing won't be dry by the first snow. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. He had to start the curing fires. He gathered a handful of twigs and dry splinters and laid them in the firebox. He lit a match. Smoke, thick and acrid, billowed out of the feed tube, filling the cabin with a gray haze. It didn't draw. The air inside the long, cold, damp flue was too heavy. Boro whined and retreated toward the door, his nose twitching. Elias's heart sank. From outside, he could imagine the whispers. "Told you so. He'll smoke himself out like a ham." He didn't give up. He remembered a passage in the journal. "A cold flue is a stubborn mule. You must warm its throat before you ask it to work." He lit a piece of rolled-up newspaper and pushed it deep into the clean-out door at the base of the heat riser, preheating the column of air. He tried again. This time, after a moment of hesitation, the smoke wavered, then reversed course, being pulled with a soft whoosh into the firebox and up the riser. A proper draft had begun. For 2 weeks, he lit these small, smoky fires. He couldn't leave the cabin, tending the flames, making sure they never got too hot, which could crack the damp cob, but never letting them go out. The cabin was constantly hazy, smelling of smoke and damp earth. He slept on the floor by the door for fresh air, Boro curled beside him. The community saw the weak plume of smoke trickling from the new stovepipe in his wall and shook their heads. It was a pathetic sight compared to the robust columns rising from their own chimneys. They thought he was failing. But inside, a slow miracle was happening. The surface of the bench began to lighten in color, from a deep, wet brown to a pale, dusty tan. Steam rose from it in invisible waves. He could feel a faint, deep warmth beginning to build in the mass, a slumbering heat that lingered long after the small fires went out. While the heater cured, he used what little time he had to prepare for the winter. His woodpile was a joke compared to his neighbors, but his strategy was different. They chopped cords of smaller logs, fuel for their hungry fireplaces. Elias spent 4 full days on a single tree, a massive, wind-fallen oak at the edge of his property, its wood dense and heavy as stone. He sectioned it with his father's crosscut saw, the work agonizingly slow. He split one of the rounds into smaller pieces for starting the fire, but the main prize, a single colossal log 4 feet long and nearly 2 feet thick, he rolled into the cabin with immense effort. It was his reserve, his proof. The day the sky changed, everyone felt it. The air grew still and heavy, and the color drained from the world, leaving a flat, oppressive gray. The temperature, which had hovered around freezing, began to plummet. Mr. Gable stopped his cart on the road again, his face grim. "This is it, boy," he said, his earlier mockery gone, replaced by a grave seriousness. "The big one. My grandfather used to talk about skies like this, said it was a sign of a white hurricane. We might not see the ground again till spring." He looked at Elias's cabin, at the wisp of smoke, and at the insultingly small woodpile. "God help you, son." Elias just nodded. "You too, Mr. Gable." That evening, the first flakes began to fall. They were not the gentle flakes of weeks before, but hard, stinging pellets driven by a rising wind. Elias went inside and sealed the door. Boro was already lying on the earthen bench, which was now fully cured, its surface pale and hard as stone. It was cool to the touch. Elias looked at the journal one last time. "When the test comes, do not be afraid. Trust the design. A small, hot fire. Let the mass do the work." He knelt before the firebox. He laid a bed of kindling and stacked a few of the smaller oak splits on top. He lit the fire. With the flue now warm and dry, the draft was instantaneous and powerful. A low roar started, the sound of a contained furnace. The flames were not lazy and orange like in a fireplace. They were white-hot and fierce, sucked sideways into the riser. He added more wood, piece by piece, for an hour, feeding the fire until the inside of the brick chamber glowed with a ferocious intensity. He felt no direct heat in the room. All of it was being siphoned into the heart of the earthen beast. He stood up and placed his hand on the bench near the firebox. It was warm, not hot, just a deep, pleasant warmth, like a sun-baked stone. He moved his hand further down its length, feeling the heat slowly migrating through the clay and sand. After 2 hours of the intense burn, the entire 18-foot length of the bench was radiating a steady, gentle heat. The air in the small cabin, which had been frigid, was now comfortable, then warm, then deeply, luxuriously warm. There was no smoke, no haze. The combustion was so complete that the exhaust leaving the pipe outside was almost clear. Then, he did what he had prepared for. He took the single massive oak log and with a grunt of effort maneuvered it into the firebox. It fit snugly. The intense heat from the fire brick walls caused it to smolder, then catch, but it did not erupt in flame. It began to burn with a slow, steady, flameless consumption, like a giant coal. He was done. His work for the night was over. Outside, the wind howled, a physical presence that slammed against the cabin walls. The snow was coming down in a blinding sheet. Elias sat on the floor, leaning against the warm bench, and listened to the storm. Boro stretched out on top of the bench, his entire body relaxed, and fell into a deep, contented sleep. The cabin was an island of quiet, steady warmth in a world of screaming, frozen chaos. The storm did not stop. For 2 days it raged. The snow piled up, burying the windows, sealing them in a white tomb. The wind was a constant shrieking madness. Through it all, the cabin remained warm. The single oak log continued its slow, steady burn, and the bench continued its slow, steady release of heat. Elias ate his stores of smoked meat and dried apples. He read his father's journals. He slept on a cot he pulled up next to the bench. It was the most profound peace he had ever known. On the morning of the 3rd day, there was a frantic pounding at the door. It took Elias several minutes to shove it open against the deep drift that had formed outside. A figure, completely caked in snow, stumbled inside. It was Mr. Gable. His face was pale with cold, his beard frozen solid. He stared around the cabin, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had expected to find a frozen boy. Instead, he was hit by a wall of warmth. It was not the scorching, dry heat of a roaring fireplace, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that filled the entire space. "How?" Gable stammered, his teeth chattering. He looked for the fire, but there was no roaring hearth, no flickering light, just the silent, pale, earthen bench. Boro lifted his head from his spot on the bench, thumped his tail once, and went back to sleep. "The bench," Elias said simply. Gable stumbled toward it, touching its surface. It was like touching a living thing. "It's warm. The whole thing." He looked at the firebox and saw the giant log, glowing a dull red, barely seeming to burn at all. "That one piece of wood?" "For 2 days now," Elias said. Gable sank onto the bench, the warmth seeping into his frozen body. Tears welled in his eyes, freezing on his eyelashes. "We're out of wood," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The fireplace, it just eats it. And the wind, it comes through the walls. My wife, Ilara, the children, they're huddled under every blanket we own. They're so cold." Elias looked at the man who had called him a fool. He saw no triumph, only a neighbor in need. "Bring them here," he said. It was a desperate, dangerous journey back to Gable's homestead, but they made it. Soon the small cabin was filled with people. Gable's wife, their 2 young sons, and Ilara, her face pinched and blue with cold. They crowded onto the bench, soaking in the impossible warmth. Mrs. Gable wept with relief. The boys, after a few minutes of shy silence, began to treat the curving bench like a warm mountain, climbing and sliding on its gentle slopes. Ilara sat near Elias, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of chicory coffee he had made. "You did it," she said, her voice full of awe. "You really did it." He saw in her eyes the same belief he had seen in his father's writings. By evening, there was another knock. It was Mrs. Finch and her family, their situation just as dire. The cabin was now crowded, but no one complained. They shared what little food Elias had, their bodies pressed together in the small, warm space. The storm outside seemed a distant thing, another world away. On the 4th day, the wind lessened slightly, but the snow continued and the cold was bone deep. A new arrival appeared, a man sent by Mr. Sterling. The wealthy landowner's manor, large and grand, was also drafty and cold. His massive fireplaces consumed wood at an astronomical rate, and his servants couldn't keep up. He hadn't run out, but he was rationing, and his family was suffering. Humbled by the relentless cold, he had sent a man to beg for shelter for his wife and 2 young daughters. Elias let them in. The wife of the richest man in the valley huddled on a dirt bench next to the wife of a simple farmer, equals in their need for warmth. That night, with the cabin full of the quiet breathing of sleeping families, Mr. Gable sat with Elias. The big oak log was smaller now, a third of its original size, but still glowing, still feeding the bench. "I'm sorry, son," Gable said, his voice low. "I was a fool. I thought I knew everything about surviving here, about wood and stone and winter. But this," he patted the warm cob, "this is something else, something smarter." "My father's work," Elias said. "Your father was a genius," Gable corrected him. "And you're the one who had the courage to build it." On the 5th day, the giant oak log finally crumbled into a pile of soft white ash. The fire was out. But the bench, its deep thermal battery fully charged, continued to radiate heat. It was less intense, but still warm enough to keep the cabin comfortable. For another 2 days, as the storm finally broke and the sun appeared like a pale, watery eye in the sky, the earthen bench gave back the heat it had stored. When the families finally returned to their own homes, the world had changed. The snow was piled 10 feet deep in places, and the work of digging out would be immense. But they were alive, and they had a new understanding. The dirt chimney was no longer a joke. It was a miracle. In the spring, they came to Elias not with mockery, but with requests. Mr. Gable was the first. "Will you show me?" he asked, holding a worn copy of a book on masonry he'd owned for years. "I want to build one for my family." Elias didn't hoard the knowledge. He brought out his father's journal and opened it on the table. One by one, he taught the men of the valley. He showed them where to find the best clay, how to test the sand, the right proportions of straw. He supervised the building of the fireboxes, explaining the importance of the insulated J-tube. That summer, 5 new thermal mass heaters were built in the valley. The next summer, 10 more. The strange, lumpy benches became a common sight, a symbol of their shared survival and a new, smarter way of living. Years passed. The valley prospered. The winters were still harsh, but they were no longer feared in the same way. The houses were warm, the woodpiles smaller but sufficient. Elias married Alara in a quiet ceremony under the old pine tree. Their life was good, filled with the simple rhythms of the seasons. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, who grew up playing on the warm earthen bench that had saved their mother's family. Boro grew old. His muzzle turned gray, his steps slow. He spent most of his days sleeping in his favorite spot on the bench, where the curve was gentlest and the warmth seemed to pool. One winter morning, Elias found him there, still and peaceful. He had passed in his sleep, warm and comfortable to the very end. Elias wrapped him in a soft wool blanket and carried him to the hill behind the cabin. He buried him under the pine tree, marking the spot with a simple, smooth river stone. He stood there for a long time, his hand on the rough bark of the tree, remembering the patient, watchful eyes of his first and most loyal believer. Elias himself grew old. His hair turned the color of winter snow, and his hands, which had built so much, grew stiff. He was no longer the strange, quiet boy on the hill, but the respected elder of the community. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. He didn't just teach them how to build heaters. He taught them what his father's journal had truly been about: observing, questioning, and not being afraid to trust a new idea, especially when the old ones were failing. He died in his own bed, in the cabin his father had built, with Alara holding his hand. The room was warm, heated by the same earthen bench he had laid with his own hands so many decades before. They buried him on the hill, next to Boro, under the tall pine. His gravestone, carved by his eldest son, was as simple as his life. It read, "Elias. He kept us warm." Decades later, the valley was a different place. New roads had been cut, and new families had moved in, building larger houses with modern furnaces. But many of the original cabins still stood, lived in by the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the first settlers. One cold autumn evening, in the cabin that had once belonged to the Gables, a young boy ran his hand over the strange, lumpy bench that dominated the main room. "Grandpa," he asked, "why do we have this big mud couch? All my friends have iron stoves." His grandfather, a man with Alara's kind eyes and Elias's quiet strength, sat down on the bench. It was not lit, but a faint, ancestral warmth seemed to linger in its core. He pulled the boy close and began to tell him a story. "A long, long time ago," he said, his voice a low rumble, "there was a winter so fierce it was called the White Hurricane. And there was a young man, not much older than your father, who everyone thought was a fool. They mocked him because he spent his autumn building this very bench instead of chopping wood." The boy's eyes grew wide as his grandfather told him of the storm, of the single piece of wood that burned for 5 days, and of the small cabin on the hill that became a haven for the whole valley. He spoke of how the strange mud bench had held the heat of that one small fire and given it back, saving them all. "This isn't just a mud couch, son," the old man finished, his hand resting on the smooth, pale surface. "This is a promise. It's a story made of earth and straw. It's the heart of this house. It's what reminds us that the best kind of warmth is the kind you share." The boy looked at the bench with new eyes, seeing not a primitive lump of mud, but a monument. A silent, sleeping giant, holding the memory of a quiet boy, his loyal dog, and the unconventional wisdom that had saved them all from the cold. Outside, the first flakes of winter began to fall, and inside, the story kept them warm.